Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with a discussion on the Express library or package, if you will, um, that we've kind of hinted around, but never done anything with it yet. So, in a prior video, I went ahead and I kind of booted up a a um, code demo, but I'm just going to kind of restart just to go through those steps again because, uh, as they say, repetition aids comprehension. So we'll start with an empty folder here on my desktop. Call it Express Demo, and just walk through a couple of steps. Now you can right click, open with Visual Studio Code, and let's go into a terminal window. Terminal, new terminal. npm init/y, and that's going to get our package JSON kind of with some default configuration settings, and then we can kind of come in here and change the description, a lecture demo code to explain Express.js. Our server.js is going to be our main file. We'll come back in here and we'll edit a script and give myself as the author, and sure, MIT, go ahead, and then npm install Express. Um, if I go back to the npm site and I search Express, here you say npm I Express, and this gets us up and going. So I'm going to quickly jump to the documentation for Express, expressjs.com, and I'm going to use this to help me explain it. Express, I think it's important to just understand, what the different pieces are. So we know that Node is a runtime environment to run JavaScript. And so that's just a couple of words that explain what Node is. So what is Express? I highlighted the three words that I would describe Express as. So explain like I'm five. Express is a web application framework. It allows us to make web applications on top of JavaScript. Web applications, you know them as websites, but when websites have a lot of functionality behind them, they have databases, they have e-commerce, they have search, they have chat, they have all sorts of functionality. When websites have a lot of functionality behind them, they're better described as web applications. And so everything we use today is a web application, be it from Spotify to Facebook to LinkedIn to Twitter. It's all, when you go to the website, you're really using a web application. And so you build on top of Node in order to use Express. Um, you need Node. And so we are using the MERN stack, which stands for Mongo. Mongo is the database. We'll get to Mongo. E is for Express, R is for React, and N is for Node. And so quickly here, within 3 days, we've talked about Node, and now we're going to get into the E, which is the Express. Express will allow you to build APIs. APIs are just libraries of code that you can put public on the internet. And so when you put a login feature to your web application, you allow a user to call your web API to essentially log into your website. And so APIs are public-facing JavaScript code that allows you to interact um, um, with your application. And so that's what Express is. It is a web framework, a web application framework that's built on top of Node. We went ahead and installed Express, and um, if you if you kind of go to my Learn Express, you're going to see these different code chunks, which I'm going to be referencing. But I like to kind of start a lot of this where we get this from is right on the Getting Started guide. And so this documentation here is essentially compiled from these resources. And so we already installed. And so then what is the JavaScript that's needed to start an Express server? And so this is Hello World. Anytime you're dabbling in a new language or a new tool, it is convention as a programmer to start with Hello World. So we're going to learn how to write Hello World with Express. And this is useful. This is right in the documentation. And their recommendation here, if you kind of jump ahead, this is going to be saved in a file called app.js. So I'm gonna do Hello World, but I can kind of see down at the bottom if I jump ahead, it's called app.js. It says embedded below is essentially the simplest Express app you can create. It is a single file app, not what you'd get if you used a generator, which creates a full app with numerous JavaScript files, templates, and subdirectories. Okay, let's kind of bring this in and talk about it. Okay, now this is my Express demo. I'm going to create a new file called app.js, and I'm going to paste my Hello World application. Now, remember with modules, there's really two syntaxes. There's the require syntax, which is your common JS, and then there's the import-export syntax, which is the ES modules. So this is using the require syntax, which is common JS. This is, call it older. It's not old, but it's older. Okay. So we're bringing in some different pieces here, and so we if we want to kind of break it down, and we do so in our lecture outline, this line right here creates the application. And so this brings in the dependency, this brings in the function called express, but right here creates our Express application, web application. And you think about, what is this really creating? This is creating a server that will respond to clients. Client server is a relationship. A server hosts something, and a client wants that something. And so when you have a web server, that's hosting a web application, we're creating the ability for a client, be it a web browser, to say, hey, I want a resource. And that resource, in most cases, is a web page. So we are creating a web application that'll basically, respond to client requests. When you have servers, servers can host all sorts of resources. And so because a server can host so many resources, you have to Um, I talked about like doors and windows kind of. You have to explain what port or what door to listen for an HTTP request. And so a server can have, it could be a DNS server, a DHCP server, it could be a file server, a print server, and they all have different ports. And so, when you have a port coming in on port 23, whatever port 23 may be, FTP, then you know to give it to that FTP software. Well, when a request comes in on port 3000, it says, "Oh, I know that's an HTTP request for my Express application." And so you get to define a port to kind of listen to. Now, by default, it's port 80. 80 is HTTP. Um, we use this port of 3000 so that it doesn't conflict. If you have another web server running on port 80, that might cause a conflict. So we boot up our app. We give it a port number to listen onto. And again, because, right now, this laptop that I'm on, the confusing part, I think, for beginners is that this laptop that I'm on, same thing with you, this laptop functions as both the client and the server, right? When you go to deploy your application, the client will be a different machine than the server. Um, so just kind of pointing that out. What we have here is a method. Remember, we created an app variable right here on line 4. We created this app calling this function that we imported basically right here. We import the function and then call that function, stored in a variable called app. And now this app has a method called get. We're gonna look at these different methods that app has. And this basically says, hey, when an HTTP GET request, and we're going to go into HTTP and all the different types of requests that you have. There's gets, there's posts, there's deletes, there's all sorts of HTTP functions. But when you have a GET request on port 3000 and it requests the root directory, that's what this / means. This is like, hey, I want your home page. Very simply, I'm going to respond with hello world. Now you're going to see res. If you're looking at kind of what happens, this get takes in two arguments. Okay, the first argument is the route. You call this the route. This is the default route or your home page, your root folder, separated by a comma. And then this is an anonymous function. The second argument inside of this get call is a function. And this is very, conventional here, that this function has two parameters. It's an arrow function. And the second, it's a request, res, and you'll also see next sometimes. But next isn't as common. We'll talk about that later. This represents two things, rec and res. I want to talk about rec and res. Rec and res. Think about this from the server. Well, there's basically two. There's an incoming request from the client. And so the request is going to say, hey, give me a file. Give me an HTML file. And that's my request. The request might contain data, useful data. Useful data. So this rec is a variable, right? It's a parameter, and it might contain useful data such as credentials, username and password, cookies, form data, so the user fills out a form and they submit it to you, that data would come in potentially under this request object. So rec might contain useful data. Right now, we're not doing that. The response is the outgoing response from the server, right? So it's just basically it's communication. A request comes in, a response goes out. Request comes in from the client, might have some useful data. Response goes out from the server back to the client. Again, keeping in mind that in this primitive app that we're building, the laptop is functioning as both a client and a server. And essentially, all this is going to do is at the home page, we're gonna send back a little string that says "Hello World," and then we have to essentially listen. We have to tell our app, we call a listen, basically say, "Hey, on port 3000, wait for incoming requests." So app.listen, you say port 3000. Here's again, it's the listen method takes two arguments, a port and an anonymous function. And then an anonymous function doesn't really do anything, but this kind of puts in the console log listening on port 3000. Okay, so if I more or less didn't change anything. I just marked this up to kind of explain the different pieces. And I want to run this. I'll say node app.js. And you can see what my my console did. It actually put it in my console window. It says example app listening on port 3000. And so it's kind of waiting for a request to come in and to basically let a request come in. Let's go back here and show you. We need to go to localhost port 3000. So it says then load localhost :3000 in a browser to see the output. So now that I'm listening to my port, I should be able to paste that localhost :3000. And this is really simple. Like literally haven't done a whole lot, but we have. We've made a web server. I mean, this is the most simple, quote unquote, full stack because you've got a front end. Haven't really done anything with the front end yet. And you've got a back end server. This is about the most simple full stack application you could do. Now, you could argue that really full stack apps should have a database. I'm not going to, disagree with you there, right? But what we have is a front end website that's really blank and really dull and really boring. And we have a back end server that's just sitting there waiting for requests to come in. And when it comes in on that homepage, it responds with a simple piece of text. And so, haven't done a lot. At the same time, we kind of have. If I were to change this, okay, and I'll update my notes here. Give me just 1 second. I just wanted to point out the difference between the common JS modules use require syntax, ES modules use import export syntax. So I would just change this line of code to do import express from Express. Okay, and so that's a simple modification that I would change, and I'm just going to, and I would say newer And if I save that and any changes, you're going to notice it's still running. Hitting Control C would stop my app from running, and I'd have to run it again after I made a change. And this is a JS, so let me change this file to an MJS. And let me do MJS. Okay, so now we're back to running, and pull up port 3000, localhost 3000, and we get hello world. Okay, so that's the only kind of tweak that I would make off of their homepage docs to use the newer module syntax. This is going to be something I haven't tinkered with. This generator, and so this is kind of interesting. You could see that it makes a lot of folders and subfolders. I'm just gonna do this just for the sake of this demo. I'm gonna make Express application generator. I've done something similar. Let's close, new folder. You're gonna see it's just gonna make a whole file structure. So let's go to code. Terminal. New terminal. And let's just run the command as given. npm install global express generator. Here, npx express generator. So npx is another command line tool that not only downloads a dependency, but also runs a dependency. So npm versus npx, there's a slight difference between the two. Let's go ahead and type in npx express generator here. Yes. And so you can see it makes a views folder, which typically is where you're going to put some HTML files. A routes folder, we're going to talk about what is a route. A public folder, which is where you put static HTML files, and basically in the public folder you put files that aren't going to change. So you put like JavaScript files and images and style sheets inside of here. It created a package JSON for us. Again, we can kind of go in here and make changes. Here's our app. It brought in a bunch of things. You're going to see it brought in Express. This is probably a little bit overwhelming to kind of start with. I can see that there's this thing called a router. That if I kind of look at the home route, it responds with the title of Express. So let's just run it. Let's just run it and node app.js. And we got to do an npm install. Npm install. So there's dependencies that we don't have inside of our node modules folder. So let's bring in node modules. Okay. Now let's run it. And let's look at the port that we're on. So if I look at my routes, where am I going to find? Let's go back to app.js. Where can I find my port? Let me find my port. So I went back to the docs really quick, and we kind of went ahead. I should have just been following along. It says on a Windows and command prompt, use this command. So it does have some debugging set, and it says npm start. I'll talk about npm start. And so let's go ahead and run that command to start our application instead of just running node like we did here. So I'm going to paste that command, set debug my app star and npm start. So let's do one at a time. npm start. There we go. So instead of running node and then the name, we can run npm. I'll explain that in just a minute. And now we look to be running. So now if I go back to localhost, okay, we get a little bit more going on. Localhost 3000, we get a little welcome to Express message. This actually has a view engine built into it. And so you might have been wondering, there is a folder called views and index.jade. This Jade is a way to say, hey, I want my H1 to say something. I want my paragraph to say welcome to title. And so we're not going to be diving too deep into Jade. I don't think, but if I wanted to kind of change that, kind of save that, and close, terminate job, yes, run npm start again, and I just put the words just a test. If I go back to my home page and reload, you can see that I'm modifying my test. Okay, let's bring it back into the lecture. So we kind of broke down the different parts, right? How to create an application, and we worked with what's considered to be the most simple route, which is we're going to talk about routing. And so Express is made up of three main parts: routing, middleware, and the view or the template engine. We jumped ahead and we were talking about the view and the template engine, but really that's out of the scope of this lecture. Really, I want to talk a little bit more about routing. And routing happens here on line 7, is where we call this get method, which is basically saying, hey, when there's a get request from a client that requests the home route, to go ahead and respond with a little bit of just text. And so let me kind of close that down, and I'll go back into my code from before. And let this load up. And what I'm going to do is make another app.get, and you're going to see how I make another route. And if I go contact, comma, the request object, the response object, anonymous arrow function, and I'll do a res.send contact me. And so now when I hit a different URL, the contact route, I should respond with something different. So this is just a real simple routing. So if I kind of boot this up, let's start my server with node app.mjs. Refresh. Okay, I get hello world / contact. You can see it responds with a different thing. So again, very simple. We're not responding with useful HTML yet, but that's what's coming. We can respond with something simple like a string, not all that useful, but I just wanted to show you how to send something back to a client with this response object, right? And this is going to be very normal, right? You're going to have a route, you register the route, and then you say what to send back to the client. So the incoming request object, and then something goes back to the client. And this is routing at its bare bones, right? You say, what is the URL that you want to create for your page? And what do you want to do with that? Now, very quickly, you can kind of imagine what happens when you have 50 or 100 pages. Like, let's just say you've got a large website with 100 different pages. You would need a different one of these routes for every one of those pages. And so this file, this app.mjs, is kind of like your starting point. You want to keep this file as simple as possible, and you want to extract out pieces if you can extract it out, right? So if you know programming kind of basic concepts, it's like, hey, keep files minimal, keep them as simple as possible. And so one thing that we'll do is we'll take all of our routes and we'll kind of extract them out of this starting file using what's called a router. And so that's kind of something that's coming. But just to kind of show, one more, if I do, of course, if I do contact and if I do / about me, whatever, we could say about me, and we have to, when we make a change, we have to Control C to stop it, and then you hit the up arrow to rerun it. So every time you make a change to your source code, you have to stop and restart it. And I want to show you kind of how you might. So my contact me still works, and if I go / about me, you see I have another route kind of defined. Another thing that's kind of nice here is you can add in a little HTTP : / and in addition to the let's make a variable called host name equals process env.hostname or localhost. So that you can kind of see this is foreshadowing. We're going to have an environment variable called host name, but if it doesn't load out of the environment variable, it's going to load localhost. And so now our link is going to go to http : / let's put in localhost : port, And by changing this, adding this host name, to add local host, we control C. If I rerun it, host name. I need to put the word host name in here. There we go. Now we rerun it. Now this makes it a link, and if I hold control, it just boots it right up into my browser. Right, so that's kind of a neat little add-on that you can add to their document. Just turn that into a link so that you can just control click and boot up your site in a browser. Okay, what I kind of wanted to do next is fix this, that I have to keep, every time I make a change to my source code, I have to go in here and close it down by hitting Control C and then hitting the up arrow and rerunning it. I mean, it's not a huge deal, but there's actually a pretty neat tool that can kind of help us reduce the keystrokes. And so in development, this is a nice little tool, and it's called .env. Um, .env, or excuse me, nodemon, not .env, nodemon. We installed nodemon earlier, and we installed it globally. And so um, the way that we can run nodemon, and so if I kind of demonstrate nodemon, so I'm not running. So instead of running node, I'll just say nodemon app.mjs. And this is an error that I'm sure you hit as well if you're following along. And it basically is an easy to fix error. Kind of want to show you how to do this. Here's what this is. And this is basically, you can see we're running in PowerShell. And PowerShell has some restrictions about letting outside code run. What it can do, outside code, permissions, if you will. And so what you want to do here is go to this link, and you can see I've highlighted it here. And if you just right click, that should put it on the clipboard and paste, and that's going to bring you to a Microsoft article. Okay, you just have to do this once on your machine, and then this error goes away. And you can read about this error, the different options that you can kind of set. Scroll down. This is reading execution policy. And this is the command that ultimately we want to run. And we're going to run this in PowerShell. And so you can kind of scroll down here if you follow me. Set execution policy remote sign. So I'm going to copy this little command. And in Windows, you can run a PowerShell command prompt. Now, when you search for it in Windows, you need to run this as administrator. Okay, I'm not sure that this command will run if you don't run as administrator, so I'll go ahead and click that window. It's worth noting not to play around in here because this is a, you can delete something inside of Windows System 32, and the next thing you know, you're in trouble. And Windows won't boot. So don't play around in here, but we will go ahead and paste this command that more or less allows us to run external code if it's been signed kind of like through an approval process. And it says policy change, yes to all. I'm going to type in the capital letter A to say yes to all, and hit enter. And that essentially should fix our problem. I go back to the blinking cursor, and I'll type in exit to exit our command prompt. Now I go back to my code window and run nodemon again. Problem solved. So now you'll notice, there's it's running, and I can boot it up and say hello world. Now, if I go back to my source code, by the way, if I look at the errors here, it says watching extensions, JavaScript, MJS, and JSON. So if you make a change to any of those extensions, it will reboot your server for you. Again, it just saves you those keystrokes that we were having to stop the server and restart the server. You'll notice it does not include HTML files and CSS files, basically your JavaScript files. And so what I'll do in here, I'll just say hello, Grant, and file not saved. If I hit Control S, you notice restarting due to changes, starting, and it's running again. Control click, and now it's effectively running my code. So NodeMon is nice. It's really easy to set up. You install it once, you change that PowerShell setting, and then you use it all semester long to reboot your Express server when changes are made. Let me close down those windows. And now we have NodeMon running. Now, I'm going to stop, Control C, I'm going to stop NodeMon. You'll notice the command nodemon app.mjs. Inside of package.json, I keep talking about these scripts. I'm going to change this test script to start. And when I run the script called start, I want the command that runs to be node app.mjs. And just because I want to call this server, I'm going to call it server.mjs. And back in my package JSON, I'll call this server.mjs. Okay, so now I have this script, and I can run it by saying npm run start. And that's essentially running the node command as we know it, as we've learned it. And so I've made a script. The reason this is useful is in deployment. A deployment server typically looks for a start script. So you want to include a start script that runs node. Let me close this down. And I'm going to add in another script, put a comma there. And I'm going to say start dev. Well, obviously, the start will be for production. Start dev will be for development. And in development, I'm going to run nodemon server.mjs. Okay, so now by running this start dev script, I'm really going to be running nodemon. If I close that down, and I'm going to type in the command npm, you got to say run start dev. And essentially what you're going to do is boot up your nodemon. And that's a development script, so that anytime, like I said, I go in here and I hit Control S, it kind of reboots my server, and that's what I want it to do. Great. So I've got this variable here called host name. And so what we've done, to kind of highlight what we've done, we've started looking at nodemon, but really we're focusing on Express. We've done a little bit of routing with Express, and we've done hello world. So we haven't gotten very far, but really there is a lot kind of going on here. We've got this variable called host name, and we're creating a link to kind of boot up. I'm also going to make a variable called port. And so up top, I've got this port. I'm just going to move this line kind of down here. And instead of just setting it equal to 3000, I'm going to set it to process env.port, or say 5000. Okay, now the way this is going to work is it's going to look for an environment variable called port, and if it finds it, it'll assign it to this variable called port. Otherwise, it'll assign 5,000. So now we're running on 5,000. You can see I switched from 3,000 to 5,000 because there is no port environment variable. And so now my web app is running at 5,000. By the way, you can make these up, like these port numbers. Anything above uh, available port numbers. Um, and so, you can kind of see here 0 through 1,000 are pretty much reserved as well-known ports. After that, there's a lot of open ports that you can kind of use. And so, it doesn't really make a big difference. 3,000, 3,001, 3,030, you kind of get to make up the ports because they're all, for the most part, available. But you're going to notice I've kind of referenced this environment variable a couple of times. And so you can put um, settings for your application in a global type of variable. Again, environment variable. We talked about those. Um, but we have to install that package. And if you remember, that's called the .env package. So I'm going to go ahead and Control C to stop my node mon. And I'm going to do an npm install .env. And so that brings in the package here. Now I need to import my um, .env. Actually, no, I don't need to import it because it's available through process, I believe. So the next step is to actually, yeah, I do need to import it. I'm silly. It even says in my notes, must be line 1. So I'm going to go to line 1. I'm going to import star as .env from .env. Now it's kind of gray because we don't have this file yet. Now to create my .env, I go in here and make sure I'm not clicking on anything. In other words, I'm not like in the node modules folder, kind of in the root. I'm going to click on new file and type in my .env file. And so you can see this file I could put a little comment here, environment variables go here. And I'll set my port equal to, just show you 3,000, and host name equal to localhost. So now that I have a .env, I set my port at 3,000. It should, if this .env is working, it should set my port to 3,000 and use 3,000. So let's boot this back up. npm run start dev. And I'm forgetting something. It's still running on 5,000. What am I forgetting? Simple line of code. I'm going to type in .env .config. No. Yes. Okay. So now I changed my source code. Now you can see it's running on 3,000. So good. These are the two lines that are necessary, and they do need to go at the top, line 1 of your server. And so we will add to the environment variables here as we go along. But now that we have host name of localhost here, well, it's still using localhost, so that's all good. The last thing to notice or to note about the .env, we will want to add .env to the get ignore. Because sometimes you wind up storing sensitive data in here. You don't want to put that sensitive data on GitHub. And so just something to consider as you're working with the .m file. Okay, so that's .env. Next up, I've mentioned the debug package, and I believe I have it installed. Let me check. I do not. So I do not have debug installed, so must have been a prior npm I debug. Okay, and so now we have debug installed. Let's bring in debug. So we brought in Express. Again, all of our imports at the top. Import debug from debug. And there's just like here, you have an import, and then you run like a config line. We basically need to make, when you have a debug, you kind of make like what's called a channel. And so we're going to make a channel const. We're just going to call it debug main. That's going to be our main channel. Equals debug. And we're just going to say this is in the in our app, in our server file. And so you can have different channels. This is going to be the server channel. And down here now that I have, again, what is debug? I've explained it once. I'll try and do it quickly. It's twice. It's a more modern console log. Console log is actually synchronous. So if you're using console logs, that's considered to be slower. Debug is more asynchronous code, and so it won't slow you down as much. And so you're going to notice down here on my console log, I'm going to replace my console log with a debug main, the name of my channel. So I'm just going to call this debug main, like such. I replace console log with debug main, and if I get this running again, it is in fact running, but it didn't pop up like I expected it to, so I'm forgetting one thing. You will see me make little mistakes, but I will fix them. Many little things to get this up and running. What I didn't do was set the environment variable to display all the channels which start with app. So I actually have to go back in here and set debug equals app : star. And so now it says by default all debug messages are disabled. To enable the debug messages to be shown, we have to include this here, and that's a .env. So I'm going to close that down and rerun. And I believe there's one more thing to include. All right, I think the last step to get this to work So I have to throw in on my start dev script. I'm going to change this with I'm going to add a switch to look at .env/config. And that was the last step. Um, so um, we had to tell NodeMon to look at .m for configuration settings to get this to work. Now, remember I was comparing and contrasting Notepad and Notepad++. Now our console logs say app server, app listening on port, and it's color coded. Our different channels, we talk about making channels on this. This one is basically saying, hey, this is my server file. Our different channels can have different colors, so that's useful. We can kind of come back in here and say debug main, and I'll say request made for home route. And so this is actually pretty nice. You hit here, and then this is doing a console log, request made for home route. And so this is a very useful troubleshooting tool that I wanted to demonstrate getting up and running. And again, what I had to do, a couple extra steps, not only install .env, you had to add a debugging configuration setting, and then you had to, in your script, tell NodeMon to look at .env for configuration settings. So it's a little bit of whack-a-mole, just kind of chasing all these different lines of code to write, but we got it now. We've whacked all the moles. And that is using Express, that's using .env, and that's using debug. Going to expand a little bit on routing next. And so if I kind of close this down, I've done a little bit with some different routes. I mentioned getting a router kind of configured, and not only getting a router configured, but also different HTTP methods. There are other methods that we can interact, not just get requests, but there's posts and deletes and all sorts of things. So that's coming up next. We'll take a short break. Okay. Keep in mind what app is, right? App is an instance of Express. And so when we're saying app.get, you're telling your web server that, hey, when a client makes a get request to your home directory, respond with this. There are different kinds of requests, right? There's a post request and a put request. A post is typically is a you're posting a form, right? So if you've coded HTML before, you know that there's a form, on your web page, and when you click the submit button, that submit should send a post request to your server. And so to handle a post request coming from a client, it is not a get request, it's app.post. And put is very similar to post. In fact, some people don't even, a lot of developers don't even use put. They just use post for all post requests coming from forums. Some would argue that you should use a put request for like updating data, whereas a post request would be like, hey, I'm inserting a new customer. A put would be more like an edit of a customer, but you can technically use post for both new customers and edits. So there's kind of a debate going on, but suffice to say, post is for new records coming from the client. Put is some people consider that for edits. And then app.delete, this is a method for deleting records. Now we'll use these kind of moving forward. Again, I'm kind of just going through the tutorial a little bit more, which kind of leads me here to serving static files in Express. And, this is going to be useful to us because right now our app is just sending back text and it's not really useful. But if we want our web app to send back HTML, CSS, JavaScript, this is a way to serve static files. Everything you've done up until this point has been a static file. At Rankin, your whole HTML class was learning static HTML. So you can see here to serve static files like CSS, JavaScript, and images. Kind of zoom in, use the Express static function. So express.static root and then options. It says the root argument specifies the root directory from which to serve static assets to your files. And so it is convention that your static files are stored in public. It says, for example, use the following code to serve images, files, CSS, and JavaScript files in a directory named public. So pretty simple command. It says now you can load the files that are in the public directory. So go localhost, loading JPEGs and CSS app as such. It says Express looks up the files relative to the directory. So I'm going to go through this and then we're going to do it, right? I just want to kind of walk you through it like you're walking through it for the first time. So pretty simple line of code to serve up static files. To use multiple directories, call it multiple times. Okay, we won't necessarily do that. To create a path prefix where the path does not actually exist in the file system, specify a mount path. And so if you want to say /static, now notice here, app.use, this is an argument before. So this argument, this what they call a mount path, would come before and then that just appends this new route, this new folder that is ultimately in the public folder. And finally, however, the path you provide to the Express static function is relative to the directory from where you launch your node process. If you run Express from another directory, it is safe to use an absolute path of the directory you want to use. Okay, so let's tinker with this. Constant path is require path. Okay. So let's kind of start up at the top and start with this line of code. Back here. And so after our imports up at the top, create our app, and let's add in this app.use public, and let's create a folder here, new folder called public, and I'm going to create a new file, index.html. And I'm just going to make I'm going to copy and paste like a little bootstrap template. You don't like doc type? We want it all caps. Doc type. Now you're happy. So we got a little bootstrap static HTML file. It is inside of the public folder. And now you can see it is loading my bootstrap demo. So that's pretty simple to kind of get that up and running. This is my home page. And so now literally just adding that line and if I change it and say static file demo, H1 that says this is my home page, click, so that's pretty simple, right, to get a static file hosted with that line of code. Now, I am interested, however, the path you provide is relative to the directory from where you launch your node. If your Express app, if you run the Express app from another directory, it's safer to use the absolute path so you might come back to that. Let's go to more examples. Okay, more examples really dives deeper. We are past the intro on Express, because these are all things that we will talk about. But that is past the that is the end of the getting started guide. And let's make in public, let's make a new file, contact. And back to server. So if I go /contact, just because that file is named contact. So if I do /contact here, that's your route. But if I actually plug in the .html, it takes you to the page. So this is the JavaScript that's responding with just regular here. Okay, I have this working how it's how it's going to work for now. You know, kind of when I load up the site, you know, I could tell the difference between my static HTML that I'm serving and the route that I've created, right? So this is just returning the string. But if I type in contact.html, of course I go to my contact page. And so, you know, I don't even think I need that. I think everything can be done as such, right? So my contact page, so all I have to basically do is to use this public folder, and then I can reach my static content this way. If I want to get to my routes, which gets us more dynamic content, we would do /contact, and this gets us the more dynamic, server-side response. Okay, so there's a difference between like static content that never changes, which is handled at your route, and the static content, which is your static HTML page. What we're going to do is we're basically going to make a landing page, and so you can think of your home page, home page right here, and we'll create links to our different routes. So if I want to say something like, obviously an anchor tag to contact.html, contact me, this can refer to, that can link us to the contact page. How static HTML works, but also now we can create links to contact, and this is the more dynamic server-side response. And this is a static HTML file. So close, refresh, static HTML page, and my dynamic server-side response. So that's a pretty simple line of code. That might change. This single line of code might change as we go on, because you can obviously do more, but and it kind of hints at like, hey, if your files aren't all in one folder right now, like everything's kind of, there's not too many folders, but as that changes, you might need a more dynamic line of code here to handle the fact that things are going to be in different folders. But for now, this works. So that's serving static files. What next? Let me go back to my lecture notes. Page not found, right? So a pretty standard error page is a 404. A 404 says that the endpoint is not found, like you can't find the resource. And so we can set up kind of error handling for those cases. With an app.use. And let's do this. Okay, that's all situated. Let's go to down here. So let's register an error handler. Okay, and so this is going to be to handle the 404 app.use. Now I did mention earlier we've got the request object, the response object, and we have a next, which is next is what you refer to as a middleware function. And so next is a function that happens anything in between the request and the response. So you think a request comes in from a client, a response goes back to the client. Middleware are any JavaScript functions that happen in between. And so app.use, and we need to make our anonymous function here. anonymous arrow function. Got one extra curly there. One extra curly there. Another method is we can say, hey, this is text plain. I don't know that we need to do that, so let's add a type plex. We're going to send an error message that says, sorry, can't find -t, can't find backticks here, backtick. And then remember in the request object, tells us some information about the request that was made from the client. So we're just going to send back a status of okay. So if I boot that up, I typed in, so if I kind of go back, this is my home page. I typed in /about. There is an about, so it says, sorry, can't find an about. So instead of getting, we can control the error message that the user sees, right? Pretty simply by adding in this error handler line of code right here. Okay, and I think we're at a near good stopping point. I'm going to add just a couple more lines of code to this, and this is Hello World version 3, right? We've done a lot more than just Hello World, but we've kind of gotten Express up and running. The next thing I want to add that you will kind of set us up for later is a line of code after we create our app, and we can actually do it after our routes. This line of code is going to set up Express to basically handle form data coming from the user. And so this is just a line of code that we will add in again to work with form data from the user. And one more line of code. A lot of times when we send information back to the user, right now we're just sending back plain text. We might want to send back some other type of information. And so we're going to bring in, allow our app to send back JSON. And that should allow us to send back a JavaScript object. With res.json. And if I get my syntax right, there we go. So when I go to about me, path, you can actually see it returns JSON to the browser. So these are kind of two very common lines that you're going to put inside of your Express server to both kind of work with form data and to enable you to send back JSON, not just send back strings of text. It is more common to send back JSON. All right, that is kind of where I wanted to stop this one. Certainly not everything there is to know about Express, but that's a really good jump start.